Hello again, Year 10 historians. It's time to talk about being counted. So we're continuing our journey along, finding out about Indigenous rights and freedoms. And this one is about being counted. It's about the 1967 referendum. I just want to point out something now that constantly drives me nuts, and I have students all the way up to Year 12 thinking this. The 1967 referendum was not when Indigenous people got the vote. They got the vote 5 years before that, as we're about to find out. Okay, our learning goals for today include knowing when Indigenous Australians got the vote. 1962. Except in Queensland, it was a few years later. Knowing what the 1967 referendum achieved, and be able to solve problems. A little activity related to that. Okay, so we're going back a bit here. This is before the 1967 referendum. The 1962 Electoral Act amendment. There was obviously already an Electoral Act because it was the law that allowed people to vote, but they made an amendment, a change to it in 1962. So, let's go back even further here. Racial segregation, which is the separation of different people based on their race, was being fought against overseas, which made Australians question it, yeah? There's a lot of stuff going on in the US about racial segregation, so Australians got interested in it. Also, the Australian government was under international pressure to change, yeah? Australia had a fairly unequal policy towards Indigenous people, and they were under pressure from other countries to change their ways. In 1962, the law changed so Indigenous people could vote in every state and territory except Queensland. It took Queensland another 3 years until they allowed Indigenous people to vote. Right, so in the lead up to the 1967 referendum, it was a referendum to change the constitution. There was a lot of groups around that really wanted that vote yes to include Indigenous people in the census. They really wanted that vote to be high, so there was quite a lot of public gatherings and marches and stuff like that saying yes, there shouldn't be any apartheid. Remember, apartheid is the system that they had in South Africa, which was a really extreme version of racial segregation. And this poster being held by someone was saying, we don't want apartheid here in Australia. Give them full citizenship or full rights. I can't remember what it says down the bottom. And here's a little kid and some old dude holding up some signs. They are marching because they wanted people to vote yes for Aboriginal rights. Right, so here we go. The main event, the 1967 referendum. Before 1967 referendum to the Constitution, Indigenous people were not counted in the census. What's a census, I hear you ask? A census is a regular count of population. It helps the government to manage the country. So it's only when you know how many people live in your country, you can decide how many schools you need to build, how many hospitals you need and where they are, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't count Indigenous people in your census, then those numbers are going to be wrong. The Constitution, as it stood, the one that was passed in 1901 when Australia federated into one country, said Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. The 1967 referendum changed that. So here it is. This is the actual wording of that change to the law to alter the Constitution so as to omit certain words relating to people of the Aboriginal race, yeah? So if you have a look down here, this was what it was specifically getting rid of, other than the Aboriginal race in any state, yeah? So this was saying we shouldn't be leaving them out of the census. We should be counting them just like all the other human beings in Australia. So, Australia's constitution, the only way to change it is via a referendum, which is a binding vote of everybody. Only 8 times has this been successful, yeah? There's been 44 referendums since 1901, and only 8 of them have been successful. The 1967 referendum was one of those. So, On the 27th of May 1967, the referendum asked, should Indigenous people be counted in the census? And should the federal government make laws about Indigenous people, not the states? So before the 1967 referendum, each state individually would make laws about Indigenous people. The change that happened from the 1967 referendum to the Constitution was to allow the federal government to make laws about Indigenous people that would cover the entire country. Australia has a political system that is federal, which means that you've got states and then the federal government above them. And sometimes it can get a bit murky about who gets control over what. For example, in Australia, state schools are run by the states, funded by the states, but independent schools, private schools, are partially funded by the federal government and partially funded by the state government. It's a little bit confusing. Things like the military and international trade is dealt with by the federal government, but things like hospitals and most schools are run by state governments. So, the referendum said the federal government should be allowed to make laws about Indigenous people, not the states. And the reason for that was because the states all had different laws for Indigenous people, and it made it quite confusing and unequal. If the federal government could make laws about Indigenous people that would trump the state ones, then they could easily pass equality laws that would cover Indigenous people in every state and territory in Australia. Well, I really like this one. Now, you guys are probably not old enough to vote, but when you vote in Australia's system, you got to number the parties or number the candidates in order of the ones you like the most to the least. And because it's quite complicated, the volunteers for specific political parties will stand there outside the gates of wherever you're voting and hand out these how to vote cards saying, you know, what order you should put your numbers in. Obviously, with the referendum, it was simply a yes or no. So the how to vote card for the Liberals just said write yes in each of the two boxes. Yeah. So the two boxes were, should we change the Constitution to include people in the census? The Liberal political party wanted people to say yes. Should they change the Constitution to allow federal government to pass laws, not just state governments? And the Liberal Party wanted you to say yes. The Labor Party did too. It was a very, very popular referendum. Okay, it's activity time. Time to learn to solve problems. So in 1967, Indigenous people had less rights than non-Indigenous people. As we know, they weren't counted in the census. There was a lot of racism against them, a lot of discrimination. There were different laws that related to them in different states. I want you to imagine that you are back in 1967, a lawmaker. What are you going to do to try to improve that? Right? I want you to come up with some practical ideas, things that would change things on the ground for Indigenous people's lives. But also you want you to come up with some symbolic ideas, like could there be speeches given, could there be recognition in the Constitution, I don't know, okay? I want you to come up with 3 ideas of your own, a brief 1 or 2 sentence explanation about what they are, but they need to be unique ideas. I don't want you to find out about ways that have already been come up with. I want you to try and come up with some ways of your own about what you could do to deal with racism and discrimination and unequal treatment of Indigenous people as it existed in 1967. Fun times. Okay, we're going to watch a video from one of my favourite things ever. It's behind the news. This is the 1967 referendum.
The 1960s were a time for change, from pop culture to milestones in science.
It's one small step for man
and human rights movements.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Here in Australia, people's attitudes were also starting to change. For a long time, Indigenous people didn't have the same rights as other Australians. They faced a lot of discrimination and weren't counted as citizens of their own country. But many Indigenous and non-Indigenous Aussies realised that things could and should be different. and they started demanding equality. In 1962, all Indigenous people were given the right to enrol to vote in federal elections like everyone else. In 1965, Indigenous workers stood up against unfair working conditions and fought for land rights. And in the same year, uni students protested against racism and poor living conditions around country New South Wales.
Mrs. Bandler, how concerned are you as a New South Wales representative?
Around this time, activists had also set their sights on a really big goal that would involve the whole nation. They wanted to change sections of the country's constitution which discriminated.
And I feel that the time has come when Australia can no longer tolerate legal racial discrimination against its Indigenous people.
The Constitution is the most important legal document in the whole country. It sets out just how Australia works, so how the government's put together, how the courts work, how the states work, and what the government can and can't do. So changing it isn't easy.
To change the Constitution, there has to be a referendum. That's where everyone over 18 votes yes or no to the changes. To get the government to even hold that referendum, campaigners set out to get signatures on a petition. They set up tables in the streets of all capital cities and country towns, and even waited outside footy matches and churches. Eventually, they collected 100,000 signatures, and after 10 years of campaigning, they finally got their vote. On May 27, 1967, Australians went to the polls. In the end, 90% voted yes to changing the Constitution. It was the biggest yes vote in our nation's history. The changes meant 2 lines were removed from the document, giving Indigenous people the right to be included in Australia's population figures and giving the federal government the power to make laws for Indigenous Australians. That last one later paved the way for things like the Land Rights Act, which has given many Indigenous Aussies traditional ownership of their land again. "50 years on, there are still problems that need to be solved. And for many years, people have been pushing to change Australia's constitution again because it doesn't recognise Indigenous Australians as the nation's first people. And it still lets governments make laws which discriminate based on race. But the 1967 referendum is still seen as a milestone in our country's history that brought Australians together and changed the nation for the better.
Really simple reflection activity today. You must summarise today's lesson in exactly 12 words. Not 11, not 13, not 12.5. 12 words. Write that in your exercise book. Yeah. Okay. Let the fun begin. It's homework time. You just need to write these 3 statements. Maybe there's more than 3. Anyway. These statements, are they true or false? The 1962 Electoral Act amendment was responsible for giving Indigenous people the vote in state elections. True or false? B. The census is an important tool in understanding the needs of a population. True or false? C. The referendum of 1967 made Indigenous people Australian citizens. You might need to do some research for that one. That wasn't covered in this lesson, that's for sure. And D. As official policy, integration was an improvement on assimilation. True or false? Okay, some of you are keen bean machines and just love that homework. So, read chapter 4.8 from Jacaranda History Alive 9 and watch this video. This is a video called Counted. It's about the 1967 referendum. It's by Stan Grant. It's a broad history of race relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in the 20th century. Stan Grant, I'm picking up an Australian accent. Stan Grant is a fantastic communicator. He's an Indigenous man. Anyway, there's the link, bit.ly/counted1967. Thank you so much for getting stuck into this lesson. I appreciate it a lot. And keep it real.